Yesterday was a very notable day for all of us as Christians. As you well know, the last day of unleavened bread was a day that we celebrated and marked yesterday. And it was, of course, the culmination of several days of considering God's will in our lives and the idea of removing sin from our lives and putting God's Spirit and God's mind in our lives. But you know, we weren't the only other people who had a big day yesterday. Disney and the folks at Marvel Studios had a really big day as they unleashed, if you will, their latest movie, Avengers: Endgame. According to the movie site Fandango, it looks like it's on pace to be the biggest opening box office weekend in movie history. A lot of money will be made. And of course, Disney and Marvel, they invite us all, one and all, to come and see the movie for an average ticket price, I'm told, I read, of around $10. That's pre-popcorn and soda, probably up to $20 by the time you're done with that. You can go and you can watch this film. Now, of course, you will not be the first person to see it because as the movie industry goes, there are people, movie critics, who get to see the movie first, and they review the movies, and they provide a service. Some could argue with that, but they are to provide a service to those of us who have not yet seen the movie. They evaluate the acting, the directing, the writing, and in this case, probably the special effects. And so they provide that information for us, and you can go out right now, and you may have already seen some of these reviews. So why am I talking about this? Well, we're dealing with an invitation for the movie studios to come watch it. We're looking at reviews we can access and learn about as well. So today I actually want to not talk about the movie, but I want to talk about another invitation. I want to talk about another set of reviews, also something that has been created. In this case, we're talking about God, of course, and we're talking about an invitation that he made to mankind, I would say, about 2,000 years ago through the words of Paul. And he, again, shared invitation. If you would, turn to the book of Romans, chapter 1. This is an invitation, I'll candidly say, I've read many, many times, and I've always kind of thought, I really need to do a little more research into this. I need to give a little bit more thought to this. And so I finally, I guess, got around to doing that. So in Romans, chapter 1, verses 18 through 20, we read the following. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them. What may be known of God is manifest in them, the people. For God has shown it to them. Verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. So, a little bit like the movie, if we look at the things that he made, God is telling us quite confidently, I would add, that we can see these invisible attributes of him. So finally, I thought it's time to do that. Perhaps, I'm sure some of you here in the audience have done that from time to some level or another. But it is, if you will, an invitation, and it is an opportunity to, quote, do our own review of what God created. What will we find? God, again, says you can clearly see his attributes by what is made. So let's take him up on that offer, that invitation today, and let's spend some time looking at what he has made. Now, with that said, I thought it worth spending just a moment on looking at a commentary. In this case, it's Barnes' Notes on the Bible. Probably everyone who speaks has a favorite commentary. This one seems like it most often, at least in my limited experience, seems to get it, in my view anyway, mostly right. So in terms of looking at Romans and chapter 1, this is what they say, or at least part of what they say. It says, God's perfections may be investigated and comprehended by means of his works, what he made. They are the evidences submitted to our intellects by which we may arrive at the true knowledge of God. So that's how Barnes summarized what Romans says, or what it says in the book of Romans. A couple of resources which I did not have a chance to look at, but if those of you out there would like to look a bit further, a couple of reference books that I've never heard of, they offer as additional resources. Again, I don't know how up-to-date these things are, but one is called Chalmers' Astronomical Discourses, Anyone in the audience read through that? Perhaps, perhaps not. And the second one is Dick's, Dr. Philip Dick, perhaps, Christian Philosopher. So apparently these books take on this subject in some detail. So perhaps at some time you may find that of value. Let's then move on. Okay, so we have this invitation. We have this prediction by God of what we will find when we do this. Let's then turn to really perhaps the starting point, Genesis chapter 1. And we know this is the creation account. It's well known. And we're going to start, well, there's several verses that precede this. We're going to start, because of time, where God describes the creation of man, because that will be our focus today. In verse 26, we read the following. And God said, let us make man in our image. We know that to be a unique component of who we are. In the image of God, we were created. He goes on, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And then he did something else. So there's three things that I pick up here. One, he made man in his image. Two, he gave him dominion. And three, in verse 28, he says that God blessed them. So three things took place here. And then God gave an instruction. He said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And then it concludes, and this, I would offer to you, is the first review of what God had made. And the review came from God himself. And God saw everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. So that's what God has to say about what he made. Sometimes we might make something, perhaps a dish, try it out, and we might give some sort of grade on it, at least to ourselves or to our spouse or perhaps our company who visit. The company will give a grade, of course, later on, maybe not in your listening. So that's our first, if you will, review of what was made. So we're going to build upon that theme today, and we're going to keep going. We're going to go next to the book of Psalms, chapter 139, where we're going to get a second review, if you will. Use that analogy for a while. And this time it comes from the pen of King David. So in Psalms chapter 139, we'll start reading in verse 13. This is from the New King James. It says, for you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. Verse 15, my frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance, being yet unformed, and in your book they are all written, the days fashioned for me. He's saying here you literally have kind of, if you will, set a time span for me to live, in this case David, when as yet there was none of them. So before he was even born, this plan, if you will, was set in place. Barnes, again, comments on this, and there's a couple of very interesting things to me that I think is worth sharing. I mentioned the word covered. He said, you covered me in my mother's womb. What does that mean? Well, the commentator here says it means probably to interweave, to weave, to knit together. The literal translation would be, thou hast woven me in my womb. God has put his parts together as one who weaves cloth, who makes a basket. And here, in addition to that, it gets really interesting, even far more interesting to me. The original word, however, has the idea of protecting, as in a booth or a hut, woven or knitted together, and it goes to wit, of boughs and branches. Where have we heard that metaphor before? So that's how David described it and how he viewed his creation and his creator. And the phrase curiously wrought can be explained as, again by Barnes, exquisitely composed of bones, of muscles, sinews, arteries, veins, etc. And he says, Dr. Horn writes or adds, whereby the fetus is gradually formed and matured from the birth, it can be compared to a piece of work wrought with a needle or fashioned in the loom, which with its beautiful variety of color, its proportion of figure, arise by degrees to perfection under the hand of the artist. So here we have descriptions, reviews, again, if you will, of God's creation of mankind. A weaving together, a bringing together of various and different parts. And we see that God says it was very good. I did a great job, if you will. And he had the confidence and the righteousness, I should add, to say that. So we're going to keep going at this point. We've got a couple reviews tucked away, and we're going to move through some other reviews. We're going to look actually to the outside world. We're going to look at what the scientists, some, doctors, researchers, writers, etc., have to say. There's a long list, of course, and we don't have that much time, but we will go through that, and we'll see what these learned folks have to say. But as we do that, and before we go any further, I would ask you to do this. Please keep in the back of your mind something that we know pretty well, if not very well. God, through Paul, uses the human body as a metaphor for how the church should work. So as we learn, as we talk, and we read about these body parts here in a moment, sounds a little weird, but as we read and review those body parts, keep that in mind, as I'm sure you probably would do anyway. So with that in mind, let's just start with kind of a broad overview. Again, this is fairly common knowledge, but what is the human body? How was it composed? What does it look like? Well, different sources will tell you different things, but here's one description. The human body comprises 12 distinct systems, and their functions reflect their names. Didn't know you were coming to a health and wellness seminar, I guess. But cardiovascular, digestive, endocrine, immune, integumentary, that's a new one on me. Any medical folks out there, they know that one? I know I see Mr. King out there. He has a medical background. Lymphatic, muscular, nervous, reproductive, respiratory, skeletal, and urinary. 12 distinct systems. This particular source is called sciencing.com. Lists in terms of what's in the human body. So we know this, but let's take a moment. What is a system? We've got 12 systems operating right now in all of our bodies while we sit here breathing, whatever it is we're doing out there. 12 systems operating right now. What is a system? It's a regularly interacting, according to Merriam-Webster, or independent group of items that form a unified whole. Another definition is it's a group of body organs that together perform one or more vital functions. So that's the description of a system. We have 12 systems in our body, according to sciencing.com. And when you think about it, it really becomes what you might call, I guess, a super system. All these systems working together to give us life, to help us stand up, to help us talk, to help us hear, etc. We know this intellectually, but sometimes perhaps we don't give it a lot of thought. So let's do that today. Let's just spend a little time. I have a few slides here today, and we will see if we can get the power up and running. And again, we'll build off that scripture in Romans, the things that were made. We're going to take a look at the things that were made, or at least a small handful today, and we're going to look at what experts have said about these items. The first item, as you can see, perhaps you see that's the right word, is the human eye. So you probably can't read the words up there, but there's a lot of different parts being highlighted there in the picture. So let's read a little bit. And Mr. Morris told me it's a little jumpy, so let's go back a little slower. So this is what the folks, the experts have to say about it. The eye, one of the most complex organisms in the human body, second only in their view to the brain. Here's something that blew me away. Human eyes have over 2 million moving parts. Pretty amazing, right? Think about moving, not just parts, but moving. They can distinguish over 2.7 million colors, according to this research. And if you want to contrast it to something, as it says on the far right, the space shuttle, one of the most, according to, again, some research I looked up, it was on the list of one of the most incredible achievements of mankind, the creation of the space shuttle. The space shuttle had about 2.5 million parts in that particular structure. So not much difference, although you would say the human eye is just a little smaller than a space shuttle. So we have right now in our eyes 2 million parts, apparently, moving around, doing what they do. Pretty amazing. Here's a few other things that might be of interest. If the human eye were a camera, it would be 576 megapixels. You rate a camera. As of yet, this is a couple years old, so maybe this is a little out of date, but as of yet, the highest megapixel camera ever produced is only 50.6 megapixels. So at least at this point in time, quite a bit of difference in terms of the quality produced by the human eye. And then on the far right, modern technology is allowing cameras to improve rapidly. The human eye is still far better than any man-made device. For a camera to be able to see more details than the human eye would be quite a development. Again, it's just an outside source, a knowledgeable person writing about the human eye. And this I put in, it's a little bit technical, but I put it in just to help, I hope, illustrate what God has done. I may mispronounce something, so bear with me. The secretory cells of the lacrimal vein gland produce a highly complex product of water, ions, and proteins. At least 5 neurotransmitter receptors, 3 different second message systems are involved in controlling the different secretory processes of this highly sophisticated secretory epithelium. Now, you guys stay with me. I know this is a little bit dense. But by the way, this is also known as the veil of tears. I did not know that in the human eye there's something called the veil of tears, but it's all part of God's creation and part of what he has put in place to help our eyes operate. So that's the eye. Now I'm going to the stomach. Gross, right? But it's the stomach. So what can be neat or amazing about the stomach? Well, let's see what they have to say. Here's one that caught my eye. The acid in the stomach is so concentrated, if you were to drop a piece on a piece of wood, it would burn right through the wood. So the question would arise, well, how come we don't have holes in our stomach? Well, I've read a few things on it, and there's some question about exactly why it is, but it appears to be that there's an offset in terms of the pH balance between the acid, and there's some alkaline substance that's being produced to offset the acid, and that's why we don't just eat, the acid doesn't eat a hole right through our stomach. And here's a statement which may be obvious, but maybe we never think about it. Very few things in life you can't live without. If someone asks you, oh, I couldn't, or says to you, I couldn't live without it. Well, here's one thing you can't live without. You can't live without a digestive system. You can't live without a stomach. I mean, that's common sense, but when you stop and think about it, it's pretty amazing what God has put inside of us. And a final quote, it's a complex organ that requires a variety of cell types to perform its function. Let's keep going. The heart. A lot of facts here. In fact, those of you who were in Sherman yesterday heard, in my opinion, was an amazing and fantastic sermon by Mr. Kylo about the human heart. He started to worry a little bit because he was starting off with some facts and figures that I thought he was about to talk about my same subject. But here's some facts and figures about the heart. It pumps blood to almost all of the body's 75 trillion cells. By the way, there's an argument about how many cells are in the body. Some say 35, 37, some say 70. Point is, there are a lot of cells in the human body. Yesterday, Mr. Kylo said that the heart beats 3 billion times. My research said 2.5, so it's in the ballpark, right? Here's one for the kids. Now, don't do this, kids, but if you left the kitchen faucet on, turned it on full blast, left it on for 45 years, I don't know who comes up with this data, but if you did that, that would equate, the water coming out would equate the amount of blood pumped in an average lifetime. So if you want to test it, you can go for the 45 years. I don't want to see your water bill. And maybe one final, a couple again jumped out at me. On the far right at the top, it says the number of heart attacks peaks on Christmas Day, followed by December 26th and New Year's. I thought that was somewhat interesting. I'm not wishing heart attacks on anybody, don't get me wrong, but that was interesting to see. Final quote, it was difficult to imagine a mechanical pump anywhere as near as good and operating so well over so long as a human heart. This is a picture of Usain Bolt. You can't see it very well. Unfortunately, I was trying to get a shot at his calves because it says that the human heart, of course, is a muscle. It works harder than any other muscle, including the muscle of a sprinter like Usain Bolt. So I guess you'll have to use, unfortunately, your imagination a bit. The ear. This one, for some reason, really caught my attention. I don't know why. Maybe I'll cut this down for the sake of time. I don't want to bore you too much with more data. But the whole process of the human hearing is amazing. Right now, as I speak, invisible sound waves are going out to you at around 700 miles an hour, give or take, entering your ear canal, going through that canal, impacting an eardrum, pushing the tiniest bones in the human body. It's a lever system, which then goes to the cochlea. It starts moving fluid, like a wave on an ocean, which then connects to hair cells. Are you with me? It connects you to hair cells, right? Which then somehow is able to convert those waves, those invisible sound waves, to electrical signals, which then get sent to the brain and get somehow interpreted. Okay. I think that's fairly incredible. A few points of data. Each ear has about 18,000 hair cells in it. I'm not talking about the hair that grows on the outside of us as we get older. It's the hair inside. 18,000 hair cells in it. Again, they're used to translate the sound. They can all fit on the head of a pin. And they're arranged, if you see a picture, it looks like the keys of a piano. It's so intricate, it's so detailed, it's really amazing. We talked about some of this already. The speed, that I talked about how fast sound travels, but once the sound gets to your ear, your brain can recognize it in 5/100ths of a second. That's how fast it all happens. And the brain. I probably scrimped on this. I don't know why, because it's the most complex organism of all. I think I ran out of energy at this point. But I think that said, the very first quote pretty much captured all we need to know. This quote blew me away. More complex than any other known structure in the universe. Not just our human body, in the universe. Again, extraordinary, remarkable apparatus, and it, of course, is in control of the rest of our body and our functions. So that is the short, or not so short, depending on your perspective, a view of some outside reviews of what God has created. These folks are not in the church. They're just folks who, that's their field of research. That's what they focus on, of course. But I think once we've done that, it's time to go back to what God put, if you will, out as an invitation. He said earlier in Romans that when you look at what he's created, we just did, we could see clearly his invisible attributes. And I will say I feel totally inadequate to try to do this, to try to sum up some of God's invisible attributes, but I will at least share with you what I came up with after going through that exercise. Here's a few things. You might want to make your own list. God has mastery over successful interaction, the performance by a group of different parts to achieve a vital function. Put it in simpler terms, he can make things work together to accomplish his will. That's one of his attributes that we see in his creation. He is a God of abundance. We talked about 37 or 70 trillion cells. Amazing. He's a master of complexity. He is powerful. He is skillful. He is knowledgeable. He is highly sophisticated in his knowledge. He is also, if you think about what he did, he created life. He wants to sustain life. He wants to enable life. He is a life giver. And lastly, at least in this list, he is the master of the microscopic. Sometimes we hear this saying, go big or go home. And of course, there's something to be said for that, make a big splash, give it your all. But God works in the microscopic realm too, and he does amazing things in the microscopic realm. And I think that's something that when we talk about meditating sometimes on God's word and what he's done, perhaps some of these things could be helpful in that regard. So let's stop. We've identified some attributes. I know it was a long list of data. I hope it didn't put too many of you asleep. But as I tried to wrap my mind around that, and hopefully you guys will spend some time doing the same, I thought, at this point, when you think about all these things, it made me think I should make a list of the things that I had nothing to do with. So here's a list. After it's humbling to think about what God did and think about it. Here's what I came up with. Things I had nothing to do with. Being born, having a body with 12 distinct systems, trillions of cells, 79 organs, 206 bones. I didn't pick out my hair color. I didn't pick out my eye color. I didn't pick out my skin color. Didn't select my family. I certainly didn't have anything to do with God deciding to call me. So you put all these things together, and I think it can create a really appropriate perspective of what we are vis-a-vis God and what God has done in our lives. As I look out there, sometimes we're trying to think, okay, I got trillions of cells out there looking back at me. All these amazing things that God has put in each and every one of us. And it's a way perhaps to consider, do we respect one another as we should? The physical creation, point one, and certainly what God is doing spiritually, point two. And as we think about this great creation, I'd ask you, if you would, let's turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 6. Matthew, chapter 6, in verse 25. I think that there's a lot in this verse. We read it and we focus on some things here in terms of God as our provider. But I think embedded in there is maybe some other things we can look at and focus on. So Matthew 6, verse 25. Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. So we worry, if we lose a job or if financially we're not doing as well as we'd like to do, and it's tough to pay the bills, and it happens to many of us over time. We worry about these things, but then Christ said, and I think this gets back to what we were talking about before, isn't life, and I'm going to paraphrase, isn't the fact that you have life more notable, again I'm adding, maybe I shouldn't, but isn't life more notable than the food that we need? And isn't the fact that you have a body more notable than the clothing you need for the body? And those reflect back to what we said. God gave us all these things. We had nothing to do with it. So if he gave us a life, if he gave us body, it stands to reason he's going to take care of us because he made us for a reason. Let's then move along. Time is fleeting, and Mr. Krabick can give me a heads up if I'm going too long here. I think I'm maybe okay. 2:37. Okay, not too bad. Let's then move on. Because, these body parts, maybe that strikes a nerve, maybe it doesn't. But let's look at what God has put in man to create. Here's a short list. You could Google this, of course, but when I did it, here's some of the things that came up. What are the great accomplishments of mankind? We know mankind has problems. The inner man, the carnal nature, is not good and has to be taken out. But God did give man dominion. We heard about that earlier. Here are a few things he's achieved. Putting a man on the moon, creating the printing press, creating the internet, smartphones, mapping the human genome. What about things that man has built? The Louvre, the Burj Khalifa, 163 stories tall, the Sydney Opera House, the Taj Mahal, you get the idea, the Great Pyramids. Here are some achievements that some say are the great achievements of mankind. Climbing Mount Everest, running the first 4-minute mile, holding and staging the Olympics as an ongoing event, the first flight, the Wright brothers, development of vaccines, sailing across the ocean, the works of Shakespeare, Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Those are some of the things that I found when I asked that question anyway. So God not only made these amazing parts that he put in us, but he gave us the ability to do amazing things and create amazing things. And I'm sure many of you do that each day as you go to work and as you live your life. So I said earlier, keep in the back of your mind that the human body also serves as a metaphor. If you would turn to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we'll visit this subject briefly. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 12. And we talked before about a system. It's a group of parts working together in a uniform fashion to achieve vital functions. I'd say it's a fair description of all of us as members of the body of Jesus Christ. God has put us together as he so chooses. Let's see verse 12. For as the body is one, has many members, but all the members of that body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body. Verse 14, for in fact the body is not one member or one part, you could say, but many. And on it goes. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I am not of the body, of course that's foolish. And it goes on in verse 17. This is maybe something we can all apply to ourselves, because it's easy to look at other people and say, oh man, I wish I was like that guy, or I wish I had that person's talent, or whatever. But he says here, if the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole were hearing, where would the smelling be? Every one of us has been put, and we read this a little bit further, where it goes. Verse 18, but no, God has set the members, each one of them, in the body just as he pleased. So all of us here today, God has put us in the body as he pleased. We all have a role to play. We're here to work together. It is part of God's amazing creation. So I begin to wrap up now. And we've talked about the amazing qualities of the human body, the great creation of God, his amazing attributes that hopefully we've seen through looking at some of the things he's made. But the reality of it is, the body is not going to last forever. Some of us are feeling that more so than others. I'm starting to feel it more as time goes by. And it made me wonder, as I was doing all this researching, well, we know that man dies, but why exactly is it that physically man dies? Why doesn't he just keep living? Well, I found an article, this is in the LA Times, and I'll try to paraphrase it and read it, that attempts to answer that question. In short, when it comes to living longer, mysteries abound. The question is not just how to do it, but whether, even if scientists could distill the fountain of youth, is there a limit to how long humans could be made to live? A new study, this was written in 2016, I believe, offers a tentative answer to that latter question. Writing in the journal Nature, research at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, slow down, George, conducted a complex statistical calculation and concluded that there is such a limit. Flip the page. Led by geneticist Jan Vieg, the team asserts that humans who have walked among us have hit that limit. And I'll just skip to the punchline. They say the statistical likelihood that just one person would live beyond the age of 125 years of age in any given year would be 1 in 10,000. The longest-lived human, they say, ever recorded was a 120-year-old French woman named Jeanne Calment. Okay, she lived to 122. And it says here, anyway, that Calment was the only person whose age at death was verified to have exceeded 120. If you would, turn to the book of Genesis, chapter 6, verse 3. God talks about the age of man, as you probably will recall. Genesis 6, verse 3. Actually, it looks like, I wonder if I've gotten this confused. I'm going to go with verse 3. And it says, the Lord said, my spirit, talking about in relation to man, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. So God, interesting, the research seems to have concluded that. So here we are. So we had a great, incredible body that God has created, but he also has put in planned obsolescence. Just like the refrigerator manufacturer, the refrigerator is going to stop working, so are we. But we don't have to despair, of course. There is good news. That's what we all help support in one way or another, the gospel that the church is working to bring to the world. And that good news is that God is not done creating. He is creating a spiritual creation. We've been talking about that, in fact, over the last week. The whole idea of putting out sin in the inner carnal man and replacing it with the Spirit of God and letting Christ live in us, that is, in fact, a new creation. If you want to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 16, or actually just look at verse 17. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away, and behold, all things have become new. We are now on our way to the next holy day, Pentecost, and we're going to be talking more and more about the first fruits, which we all want to be part of that first fruits. We all want to be, and we are part, if we yield to God, part of this new creation. We've seen the attributes of the physical man. Let's conclude by looking at the attributes of the spiritual man. If you would, in conclusion, turn to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And let's see. Trying to find the verse that I want to focus on here. I have deleted that off my notes. Let's see. Let's skip down. So 1 Corinthians 15, and let's look in verse 42. So here he's focusing on the resurrection. So also is the resurrection of the dead. The body is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. First man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. So the attributes, if you will, of the spiritual body that we are all working to inherit in its fullness will display these attributes. We will be incorruptible. Boy, I can't wait for that to happen. The Greek there suggests it is impossible for you to decay. It's impossible to deteriorate. Who doesn't want that? You know, and of course, you can say that from a physical perspective, but even more so, as Paul did, from a spiritual perspective. O wretched man that I am, who shall save me from this body of death, right? To not be corruptible in a spiritual sense. What an incredible, incredible future. And we'll have power, as it says, not subject to the physical weaknesses that we're subject to today. And that is because we will have a spiritual body.